Until now we've seen many different ways how you can filter one particular pivot table. But there is another way how you can do it, and this way is actually the reason why I've recorded the course, and this is my favorite thing about pivot tables, and one of the things that I can't imagine my reports without. It is called slicers. Let's create the basic scenario for that, and later in step number 2 we will have a look on what slicer is and how to use it. We start with creating a pivot table, and we will show sales by region. Let's make the numbers look pretty by formatting the numbers and maybe sorting the data. And after that I will create a copy of my pivot table, and within this copy, instead of regions, I will just place order date to make the analysis possible for the years. This is what actually I'm interested in. And right now, if I would apply a filter by filters shelf, or by rows or columns, if there were any, it is always applicable only to a single pivot table. But slicers is the way how you can create a filter that will take into account both of the tables, or as many tables and as many charts as you wish. That is why it is so effective as regards reporting. There are a few ways how you can insert a slicer. You can go for the insert tab and find the slicer, insert slicer in here, but keep in mind you need to place the cursor on your pivot table. If it's outside of your pivot table, Excel is not going to understand you. If you place your cursor on a pivot table, then you can hit insert a slicer and you will get the inserting slicers window. Another place where you can find it is the Analyze tab, where you can find also the Insert Slicer in here. And the last place, you can go to the Pivot Table fields and right-click some of the fields to add it as a slicer. And as you can see, you can add from here also fields to any other shelf, but also to the slicer. So we will now insert a slicer for product category and subcategory. These are two first slicers that we will introduce within this exercise. Slicers in general were introduced in Excel 2010. So if you are a user of an old version like Excel 2003 or 2007, then unfortunately this fantastic feature is not available at your computer, at your Excel. So starting from Excel 2010, this is the feature that we are working on, and it's as easy as selecting thing on a first slicer like product category, and then checking what's happening with your data. You can also apply a multi-select choice by using Control button and left mouse button. So to select together furniture and office supplies, I just use the Control button, and then I can clear the filter at the end. One of the newest features in Excel, I think it started in Excel 2016, is the multi-select that allows you to select multiple items without the need to use the Control button. So it's another option that you might find useful. As you can see on my screen, slicers are dependent on each other. So if I select the product category furniture, the subcategory slicer is not showing me all of the subcategories active. It's just highlighting those that belong to this furniture category. Of course, you can change a bit this kind of behavior, but this is once again quite a nice feature that the slicers are filtering also each other. You can also use the Shift button to do the selection from until a specific element. So you just select the first and the last element and you select everything in between. This might be useful, for example, if we study the numbers on a slicer in a second. But the most important part as regards slicers is that at the moment they are just working with my first pivot table, but I want them to filter the whole report page, all of the charts. We will build within this course dashboards for the managers, and they would like to select thing they are interested in, like a specific product category, and the whole report should be updated. And this feature can be found on the right click on report connections, where you can find the full list of pivot tables coming from your workbook that share exactly the same pivot table cache. Or in the advanced scenario, if you would use Power Pivot and the data model feature, which is not inside this course but in the other course on data modeling and DAX language for Excel and Power Pivot, then you would see in this scenario all of the pivot tables that are based on your data model. But in our case, all of the pivot tables that share exactly the same data source. In this case, this is the data worksheet, and the table we have in there can be connected to my slicer. You need to do it for every slicer one by one. So I'm right now working with my product category slicer, and I'm connecting it not only to pivot table number 1 coming from sheet number 1, but also to pivot table number 2. And now look what's going to happen when I hit OK. We start with the grand total at 31 million. But right now we just selected furniture and total sales accounts for 11 million. This is one of the best features really invented in Excel for pivot tables that you really should focus on. You can right click then the other slicer, pick the report connections to, and then repeat this for every slicer you actually have in your report. As you can see, I can also touch pivot tables that are in separate worksheets, but for us the most important is right now the main table. So I've selected furniture, I'll select bookcases. You can also do the selection from until by keeping the left mouse button on and releasing the button until you reach what you are interested in. So to select from bookcases, including chairs, until furnishings, you could actually do it without shift on your keyboard. You could just keep a bit longer your left mouse button. And as you can see, I filtered once again both of my pivot tables. This is great. There is also another way how you can connect a slicer to a pivot table by selecting one of your pivot tables and making it active as regards Analyze and Design tabs. And you can find also the filter connections on the Analyze tab. And by doing so, you can check what kind of slicers are connected to your pivot table and which of them are not. This is also a way how you can check, for example, what kind of slicers influence your pivot table. Instead of starting from a slicer, you start at a pivot table. There are many formatting and internal options of slicers that we are interested in. So let's insert another slicer, for example, on order priority. Maybe this time starting from pivot table fields, right click, add as a slicer. This is exactly the same behavior. And then check on the report connections. What are the pivot tables that you are connected to? In my case, I'm connected to pivot table number 1, so I'm just influencing the first one, but I need to stick also to number 2 to make the whole report consistent. And right now, when I go to the when I select the slicer and go to the slicer tab, you can see a lot of options as regards formatting. For example, we've got the title, which is called caption, and instead of order priority, I could say to my end user, choose priority, and this should work. Right now my priority slicer is a vertical one, but I want to create a horizontal one, and there is one interesting feature which is not easy to spot on the first time. It's called columns. How many columns you want to have in your options? We've got 5 priorities in here, so let's increase the number to 5 columns, and let's make a bit more space for my slicer. As you can see, it's now horizontal, and the working with the slicer is exactly the same as before. What is more, you've got the formatting options, so if you are looking for a specific color or for a specific formatting, you can work with these selections to make your slicer stand out a bit more. You can see right now the green choices. I select the green, the others are gray. This might help your audience understand what's happening on a slicer. Except for the default styles, you can also create your own style and format everything you wish. I hope you will not have any problems with that on your own. If you have a horizontal slicer, a good practice is to insert those slicer at the top of your report, and if you have vertical slicers, usually make space for them on the right, or maybe sometimes also on the top, depending on your needs. There are some other features of the slicers, like what is the size of the buttons, what is their width, if you need one, what is the size of the whole slicer, but probably you will not have any problems with that. Until now we saw just slicers on text fields, but this is not the only way how you can work with slicers. There are also slicers for dates, but they are called timeline, and we will discuss them in the next lesson. But you can also insert a slicer on a numeric field, like for example I will do with the profit. In here you can find all of the distinct values, unique values that appear in my source table in the profit column. So it's very similar to the list that I can find on the auto filter in my data table. And you can pick a specific amount if you wish, but if you clear all of the filters, for example, you can use this slicer in any tricky way you wish. For example, I will try to find break even for my numbers, so numbers which are close to 0. This is the amount, and then by using Shift button I will select all of the order lines we have in my data source which got the negative profit, so they actually cause a loss, and then I can analyze what is the customer region, what is the order priority, what was the date for that. This is what I can do, but you always need to remember about connecting your slicers to the desired pivot tables. In my case, I'm going to connect it also to my second pivot table. Before we move to the time slicer, you can also try to insert a slicer on a field that has been generated by us using the auto-grouped order date. For example, if I would like analyze the data by quarters, I can select this field, even though this is something for the timeline too, to create the quarters list that I have in my data. There is a small disadvantage when doing this on the auto group data that we saw already in the previous exercises, that auto fields are generated that are a bit out of the scope of my quarters list, but you can also turn it off in the settings of the slicer. And the settings can be found under right click of a slicer where you have slicer settings, or on the slicer tab on the ribbon where you can, for example, turn off items with no data. This is one of the features that you will find quite useful. Always keep in mind to connect your slicers to all of the pivot tables you wish to make the report consistent. And now the last exercise, we will create another simple slicer, which is maybe once again very similar to timeline, but this time on a date that has not been auto-grouped yet and is just a single date field, ship date. This is something we can have a look at, and you will see there that if I'm using just a date field, I will get a list of all of the dates I have in my data source that can be used. So you can then select them in a row, you can select specific dates that you wish, actually a date might also become a source for the slicer. Until now, this has been the longest lesson inside this pivot table course, but this is done by me on purpose because I really wanted you to understand the concept of the slicers, because they will become the heart of your reporting in the future, in the next lessons. Thank you very much and see you in the next lesson.